and welcome you all coming out this afternoon. We are Contemplative Sciences Center's co-sponsoring the visit with the Compassionate Care Initiative for Donald Rothberg to be here today and give this talk, and yesterday a day-long retreat for nurse practitioners and the medical community to the Compassionate Care Initiative. And we've been planning his visit here for some months now, and in conversation with Donald about that in his different capacities as contemplative teacher and as lecturer and so forth. So we're very glad to offer this to the public and open this up. He's really one of the leaders in what's called socially engaged Buddhism, bringing Buddhist ideas and ideals into socially engaged forums, making it very practical applications. So this is one of our own interests at the Contemplative Sciences Center. So in conversation with Donald, we asked him to really talk about that this evening, which he'll do. He's really been also at the forefront of leading contemplative practices in America, a place called Spirit Rock Meditation Center in California, in the North Bay. Has become one of the epicenters for insight meditation and vipassana, and this is where Donald has spent a lot of time, and he's been a resident teacher for many years. So without any further ado, thank you so much, and turn it over to you, Donald.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you, all the people connected with the center who've helped with this trip. I appreciate being here. I actually grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and would come to Charlottesville from time to time to see the sights. And then later, my parents moved from the D.C. area down to Richmond, Virginia. My father was connected with the medical college, and this was, I think, in the early 70s. And my mom was actually very involved with the efforts at desegregation. There was court-ordered desegregation, as many of you know, that went on from 1970 to 80. My mother, Bernice, was kind of right in the middle of it, working with the public school system. At one point was, I think, what they call director of race relations for the public school system, leading what we would now call diversity work, training in the 1970s until President Reagan ended the program and the funding in 1980, so it shifted then. And we also bought land, a little bit of land, in Highland County, Virginia. How many know where Highland is? Oh, very good. And so we had about 100 acres, which we got for $6,000. Good deal. And my brother and I built a cabin, and I would drive between Highland County and Richmond, coming through Charlottesville very often, sometimes stopping to pick up peaches, and go to the orchards and so forth. So I don't think I've been back to Virginia for 25 years. So it's good to be here and to be in Charlottesville. I'll say a little bit more about my background, and some of it will come out also in the talk. But generally speaking, I think sometimes of my own background as involving several areas. I have, originally, I was a student and became aware of insight meditation, the tradition out of which mindfulness comes. I was living in Boston at the time and was a student and started doing retreats, and they were mind-boggling, to go. The first insight meditation retreat I went to was 14 days, which is not your usual beginning retreat. So, but it did well with me, and I just got very drawn into that. I was in school, and I was in and in graduate school and wanted to complete my degree. And then I thought maybe I'll go to Asia, become a monk, and continue. And along the way, my intuition was that I felt very drawn to finding the forms, call them spiritual forms or contemplative forms, that make sense for this culture and that address the conditioning of the culture. And so instead of going to Burma and Thailand, which were the main places where the trainings were occurring, I went to rural Ohio, and then later Kentucky, taught at the University of Kentucky. I have a doctorate in philosophy, and I taught at the University of Kentucky, and then later Kenyon College, and was very interested in seeing what worked in this culture, right in the middle of it. And then later, I found myself wanting to be around more like-minded people. And so that's when I went to California about 30 years ago. And I thought of my own background in a few ways. One is I've been very drawn to learn from traditional teachers and traditional practices. So in Buddhist meditation, particularly learning from some of the great teachers from Thailand and Burma, but also studying Tibetan tradition pretty extensively. I remember coming, I believe in the 1980s, to Charlottesville and spending time with Jeffrey Hopkins, who was a teacher here. He retired some time ago. And but also drawn to other traditions. When I was in Kentucky, teaching at the University of Kentucky, I would go out to the Abbey of Gethsemane, where Thomas Merton was a monk, and very much drawing from contemplative Christianity. In fact, I was there 3 days ago for most of the day. I was visiting in Kentucky before coming here. And also quite drawn to learn more about Jewish tradition. My own ancestry is Jewish, and at different times I've studied Jewish contemplative practices, Jewish mysticism. 2 of the last 3 years I've actually taught in Israel, also made some trips to the West Bank, which I recently joked I could only do because I'm not a U.S. congressperson. You know that one? Not what I'm referring to. And not a woman of color. So they let me in. But I was able to, but also part of that was also very drawn. I went to, made trips to Sfat, which is the center of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism since the 1400s. And lastly, I've learned a lot in several ways from indigenous traditions, mostly being brought in by friends to different ceremonies in California, also in British Columbia. And for a number of years, I co-taught with a native elder at Spirit Rock. We had a combination of sweat lodge and meditation. And so I feel like I've drawn from multiple traditions while being especially grounded in Buddhist tradition. And of course, at times, I need to translate into what we would call a more secular approach. So that's one interest. Another interest has really been, as I mentioned earlier, to find what really works in this culture. So I've been very interested in what makes a contemplative practice come alive in daily life, not just in formal meditation or formal practice, but how does one have a contemplative attitude while speaking, listening, talking, interacting, teaching, doing whatever one's doing. And also been very interested in the intersection of psychology and contemplative practice. And I'm working on a book called Transforming the Judgmental Mind, which you can ask me about during discussion time. Has anyone here ever been judgmental? It's a big one. it's huge, and so I've been interested in that connection. And then the third area is really this connection of contemplative practice, we call it that, and social service, civic engagement, and social change work. And that's been a strong interest, probably in an overt way, for 30 years, because essentially, before I learned meditation, I was more of an activist. I was coming of age in the late 60s, early 70s. The core issues at that time were the Vietnam War and also racism, and very much where I thought my vocation would go initially, and things then opened up in the latter time, being an undergraduate and later. And after I discovered contemplative practices, it was really clear that I was interested in an integration of contemplative practices with service and action in the world. Right? And so that's been also a very strong interest for over 30 years. And it's particularly manifested in developing training programs for people who are doing service or social action and combining it with contemplative practice. So I've been involved with 3 main training programs, one of them with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. We called it the BASE program, which was meant to resonate with the notion of base communities and liberation theology in the Christian tradition. And it was the Buddhist Alliance for Social Engagement, BASE. Yeah. And so we could play with that a lot. So people who worked with the homeless had a program called Home Base. Anyway, could be playful. Right, and so that was one program which we did. I was involved with, generally it was 6 months long, and I was involved with probably 5 or 6 iterations of that over a number of years. And also involved with a similar program that we did at Spirit Rock, which was a 2-year program called, it was called The Path of Engagement. And that was 2 years. We had about 50 people involved in that program. And then a third program was done in conjunction with the graduate school, and it was a 2-year program. We did about 9 years of working with that. And that was an interfaith program, which let us have also an academic component as well as a practical component, looking at, the Jewish prophets, the life of Jesus, Gandhi, Dr. King, Thich Nhat Hanh, and so forth, right? Different expressions. So that's also been a strong interest. So pretty broad interest, and trying to also have it be practical. So that's some of my background for this theme. The theme we chose was contemplation, service, and activism, connecting inner and outer transformation. That's what I want to explore. But first I want to invite you to do a little of your exploration. So it's not just one way. Actually, my favorite part of this evening most likely will be when we talk together. Because we're basically, the short version of this is that I think that connecting inner and outer transformation is vital to the survival of the species and meeting our great crises. And it has to be a broad collaboration, bringing out creativity and commitment and energy in all of us. That's the preview. And so what I thought we'd do is just sit quietly for a few minutes to start, and then I'll ask you some questions for reflection. but just sitting quietly, in whatever way that is meaningful to you. So I want to invite now, as we continue to sit quietly, 3 questions that I'll give you, and invite you just to reflect on your own quietly, in whatever way works for you, to these questions. The first is, how do you connect what we might call inner and outer transformation? What I mean by inner transformation might be, you might talk about it as contemplative practice, or you might talk about it as living according to your deeper values, and use whatever language works for you. Could be your spiritual life. How do you connect what's more inner with learning and transformation in the settings maybe of family, relationships, work, organizations, and the larger society? How do you make that connection between your deeper inner values and process and bringing it outward? Second question is, what's challenging for you about making that connection? Again, you can frame it as connecting your contemplative practice with your activities and relationships in the wider world, or you could talk about connecting your deeper inner values with your activities, however you frame it. What's challenging about making that connection? And then third question, what qualities help you make that connection? What qualities or capacities help you to make the connection between inner and outer transformation? However you understand that. So thank you, and I'll look forward when we have some time to talk together to hear some of what you've explored, and perhaps those could be connected with observations or questions that you have. So I'd like to talk for maybe 40-45 minutes, and then we should have ample time for talking together. And recognizing that it's a little bit of an awkward time, I usually have supper about 5:30 or 6. That's okay. And I'll talk for 40-45 minutes, and then we can have some time to talk together. We likely will finish before 7, which is our further extension. We'll see, but if the energy is really going and we have ways of resolving some of the major issues of the world, we'll continue. So, I'm going to make 7 points. I'm going to organize my talk around 7 points. I thought I'd give them to you initially so you have some orientation, then I'll go through them. And they're pretty simple, straightforward points. The first is that we are in a time of great challenges and great possibilities. Both are present. The I Ching, I think number 49 says, where there is crisis, there is opportunity. Okay, so first, great crises, great challenges, also great possibilities. Secondly, connecting inner and outer transformation is, I believe, very central to addressing the core issues that we have that are both personal and collective. That will play a central role in helping us to respond adequately to the various crises. Thirdly, I want to talk about, related to one of the questions I asked, what are some of the challenges of making this connection between inner and outer transformation? There are a lot of challenges, and I'm going to name some of them. I also want to name, fourthly, some of the resources that we have from historical traditions, of traditions and beings who have, over the last few thousand years, and before that, made those connections. Fifthly, I want to sort of elaborate a little bit more on the nature of the crises and say that all of our issues, crises, difficulties, have both inner dimensions as well as outer dimensions. Something like climate crisis or racism, whatever, they have those issues, definitely have collective institutional dimensions, but they also have very profound inner dimensions. And so we need to do both. That's what I'm going to be pointing to. And if we don't deal with the inner dimensions of our problems, we'll tend to replicate the problems. Sixth, and maybe at the heart of what I want to share, might be a little longer here, I want to ask the question, what does a training look like for people who want to connect, let's say, contemplative practice with service, engagement, and activism? What's the training look like? And then seventh, sort of moving towards the end, how to come back to how both inner transformation, both that inner transformation really, at this point in history, requires being part of outer transformation, and that acting for more outer transformation requires inner transformation, that they require each other. That's what I'll be maintaining. So, number one, this is the fact that there are great challenges and great possibilities. We may be a little preoccupied with the challenges, right? The crises, but it's also, I'll bring out in a moment, there also are amazing things happening at our time. And in a way, we could say that the darkness is getting darker and the light is getting lighter. And it's sort of almost like on parallel tracks. It's very interesting. Again, many dimensions of the crisis. We could probably name quite a few. Climate issues, racism, threats to democracy, economic inequality, political polarization. That's the beginning. Right? That's the beginning naming of them. And I think these crises are also in many cases linked with personal challenges that we might especially feel being a student here, being at the university. And, what am I being educated for? What comes next? And I was thinking of a film that came out in 1951 called The Day the Earth Stood Still. Anyone seen that? I think it's entirely on YouTube, so you can go home afterwards and watch it. Okay, and the spaceship lands, and out of it comes a humanoid being named Klaatu, and he, at one point, addresses the collected audience of scientists. And what he has to say is relevant to us. This is from 1951. He says, "Your choice is simple. Live in peace or pursue your present course and face obliteration. We shall be waiting for your answer." 1951. The day the earth stood still. And so, again, we have these multiple crises. Again, I'm sure they're very familiar. Many of you know what the climate report, the IPCC report came out last year. It said we had 12 years left. Right? So we have 11 now. 11 years left. And they also said to do what's necessary, there has to be unprecedented transformation of every sector of society. So we would mean by that government, education, transportation, energy, everything. Everything has to change. Many of you probably have been following Greta Thunberg. She says, we cannot solve an emergency without treating it as an emergency. We have to act as if the house is on fire because it is. Interestingly, the Buddha also used that metaphor 2,600 years ago, saying that the house is on fire. If you really could see clearly, we wouldn't live like we do. And we have, again, one of the ways that many of us understand the last 3 years, and you know it very well in Charlottesville, is that there's also been, in a way, that things which were beneath the surface and more part of the shadow have come out into the open. You know that in terms of especially racism, xenophobia, and so forth, right? And this was moving for me. Yesterday I went to the street, which is now Heather Higher Way, and saw the flowers, and that was powerful. So we have crises around the intensification or coming more out into the open of those factors. Again, we have economic inequality, threats to democracy, such as it is. And one of the things we may see more clearly is how all of the concerns are increasingly interconnected. And so I think this was clear with the IPCC report that to deal with one of them, you have to deal with all of them, which is something that's clarifying, right? You can't just deal with one issue. You can act on one issue, but the mindset has to be that they're all connected. And again, some of this may really impact our own sense of personal challenges. What is meaningful work in this time? If I'm a younger person, should I have children? Very, very challenging questions, very often. And yet it's also a time when there are all sorts of, I think, unprecedented, wonderful developments occurring. So it's not just doom and gloom, right? What would we say? I was just thinking, what would we call it? It's gloom and joy. Can anyone think of a better phrase? I said that's okay, but that doesn't quite do it. Right? So, but it's important to see that there's also this trend towards very amazing, wonderful things happening. You know, that there are, you know, again, in terms of individual transformation, we have, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, for the first time in history, access to all the world's wisdom traditions in ways that have never happened before. And access to the depths of those traditions. In many ways, in Western traditions of mysticism have been largely inaccessible for hundreds of years. And you know, Jacob Needleman, some of you may know his work, he wrote a book called Lost Christianity. It's an interesting book. It was a double entendre. It was meaning both that some of the most precious parts of Christianity were lost, and that leads to Christianity as a whole being lost. Right? And so we have that access, and we have, you know, a tremendous re-looking at the very nature of how the mind relates to the body, relates to the qualities of love, the open heart. We have, you know, all sorts of wonderful body disciplines, yoga, qigong, and so forth. These are all becoming available. Mindfulness has been entering the mainstream, and for better and worse, but it's been entering the mainstream. We have a reconsidering of fundamental models of gender that have been dominant for 5,000 years. There are changes occurring that are pretty amazing, right? Not happening maybe as fast as people might want, and not as evenly. Right? My understanding is that the changes are happening a little bit more in terms of upbringing for girls, but that boys are largely being raised to be the same way they have been for, I don't know, 5,000 years, I don't know. Right, so, but in any case, there are new visions of shifting from 5,000-year-old patterns. That's amazing, right? It's very promising, very encouraging. People are bringing new models into work, into organization. We have more of a sense of interconnection with the rest of the world. You know, the positive aspects of the internet and the technology as people are connected and linked. I can send an email to a friend of mine who's a monk in the forest of Thailand. We can communicate back and forth virtually instantaneously. Some very amazing possibilities. Again, I think partly from the last few years, we can look at the shadow more. We can see the shadow, and I think there is the potential for, there's a potential now also, I think, for working through and even shifting in major ways 400 years of racism. That's possible. Do you know that racism is a social construction? Do you know that the concepts of race in the US developed in Virginia in the late 1600s? That there was no concept of race in the middle of the 17th century in Virginia. People from Africa could become free. There was some intermarriage. People didn't think of themselves as whites or blacks. It was especially after a rebellion occurred in 1676 called Bacon's Rebellion, in which people we now call blacks and whites were together against the rulers. Guess what? The rulers didn't like that. It was threatening. And that's when they really brought in and intensified this notion of race. They really brought it in. It's one of my people I've learned from a man named John Powell at the University of California, Berkeley. He says, one day they were defined by being from England and Christian, and the next day they were whites. It wasn't quite overnight, but it was like that. And after that rebellion is when the slave laws came into being. It's when the slave patrols came into being. It was constructed for divide and conquer purposes. Right? And the potential is to, that's when slavery became hereditary. I think that history is not well known. How many of you knew that history? Some of you. Or you taught that here? No. Okay. But that's important history to know because it's a social construction. It can be deconstructed. Right? Not easy. But because things are coming, the shadow elements are coming, there's that potential. And there's more energy and interest in doing that. Right? I see in many, many quarters. So we have that potential. We have kind of what we sometimes call the global public is getting stronger. This was what manifested in the climate marches on September 20th, which were here in Charlottesville also, right? The climate march. We had 50,000 people in San Francisco, led by 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 16-year-olds, right? Marching through the streets of San Francisco. It was inspiring. It was powerful. That sense of, and it was, how many countries did that occur in? It was all over the world, wasn't it? Right? So that's happening, And we also can see possibilities. The issues of climate are completely resolvable. Right? Again, do you know them? They're completely resolvable. People have spelled out what you need to do. There's a book called Drawdown. People know that project, Paul Hawken and others. He assembled like 200 scientists. It lays it out, it lays out 100 solutions. They're all doable. They could be done tomorrow. It's completely political will that's in the way, right? So the resolutions are there. People know what to do, and yet we are challenged, of course. We don't know how to affect the political system. And so in some ways, I think a new human being is being called into being. And my hope is that we all see ourselves as that human being and want to be on that journey, that exploration. So that's the first point. Challenges, crises on the one hand, but also amazing possibilities. Amazing ways for the human species to develop further. And second point is, that connecting inner and outer transformation will play a very large role in us meeting those challenges. That's what I want to maintain. That we, and I'll probably spell it out more fully in what I say later, but that we really need to have capacities, visions, commitments that are suitable to being with the challenges that will come up as we try to make those connections. The third point is that we have amazing historical resources, and we also have to be creative in the present time, but they're amazing resources. These were some of the things we looked at in that program I mentioned called Socially Engaged Spirituality, where we brought in ancient traditions, again, Jewish prophets, the life of Jesus, indigenous traditions, and you can look at across the spectrum in virtually every culture and find amazing resources that try to bring together contemplative values and acting in the community and acting in the world. So I thought I'd just read just a few samples of that. This is more contemporary from the work of Joanna Macy. How many of you know the work of Joanna Macy? It's a wonderful, she's a friend. She lives also where I live in Berkeley, California, and been a pioneer. She's 90 years old now. She's been a pioneer in bringing out forms of connecting inner work with particularly meeting some of the great social challenges, particularly ecological issues. She says this: "It is my experience that the world itself has a role to play in our liberation. Its very pressures, pains, and risks can wake us up, release us from the bonds of ego, and guide us home to our vast true nature. For some of us, our love for the world is so passionate that we cannot ask for it to wait until we are enlightened." And there's growing interest in this. There was a conference that took place in the Bay Area on what was called spiritual activism, and they thought that we'd be lucky to get 200 people, and they had to turn people away when they got 1,500. So there's tremendous interest in this. How many of you would like to go to that kind of conference? We'll organize it. Okay, we should have more. This is from Gandhi. "I could not be leading a religious life unless I identified myself with the whole of humanity, and that I could not do unless I took part in politics. The whole gamut of human activities today," I think it goes like 1930s, "constitutes an indivisible whole. You cannot divide social, economic, political, and purely religious work into watertight compartments." This is from Andrew Harvey, who wrote a biography of the life of Jesus. "The life and work of Jesus combines the deepest mystical absorption in the divine with the most absolute and selfless work for justice and compassion in the world." And this is from the Iroquois, from indigenous traditions. "Spirituality is the highest form of political consciousness. Political activity is set in the roots of an ancient tradition of the spirituality of our people. This cosmology places us in a balanced relationship with the universe and earth." I think you also know that the Iroquois had a very important formative role in developing the U.S. Constitution. Not so well known. And lastly, this is from the Vietnamese monk and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. "When I was in Vietnam, so many of our villages were being bombed. Along with my monastic brothers and sisters, I had to decide what to do. Should we continue to practice meditation in our monasteries, or should we leave the meditation halls in order to help the people who were suffering under the bombs? After careful reflection, we decided to do both. To go out and help people and to do so in mindfulness. We called it engaged Buddhism. Mindfulness must be engaged. Once there is seeing, there must be acting. we must be aware of the real problems of the world. So there are resources, there can be a vision of connecting these inner qualities with action in the world, action in our communities, and yet there are a number of challenges to that. And I know a lot of these very personally, because like I mentioned, I was initially an activist, and then I got involved with mindfulness, Buddhist meditation, and for a long time, I didn't feel like in either community I could bring my two interests together. You know, when I would go, I had some very hard experiences with former activist friends, telling them about meditation, what I was experiencing. I remember a very dear friend I had done a lot of work with. I talked to him about it, and we were just talking in the street, and he almost like ran away from me. I haven't seen him since. That was a long time ago. Right? And some of the people I talked to were sort of anti-spiritual. They thought that what I was doing was escapist, or something problematic. And it was somewhat of a parallel experience with many meditators. You know, a lot of my teachers seem to suggest that the real action is just meditating all the time. And that's what I should do if I was really interested in freedom. And I remember talking with people, and I didn't see people who were integrating. It was lonely, because I felt some intuition that both were important. I remember having a discussion with a Korean Zen teacher. And I remember this was in the early 80s. And it was right after there were student demonstrations in Gwangju in South Korea. And a lot of the students were mowed down in the streets by police. Some of you may know that history. And just not long after, like 6 months after that, I talked to a Korean Zen teacher, and I asked him, you know, how do you bring together your practice with responding to what's been happening? And he said, this was through a translator, he says, we do religion, that's politics, the two are separate. It's painful to hear that. Right? And you know, I can. It was lonely sometimes. And the only way I resolved these issues personally was by moving to California. You have to move to the right part of California. Anyway, no, I was at that time. That was what I was happening when I was more than my 7 years in rural Ohio and Kentucky. But I thought it was a bit of a joke. It was hard, right? Because I felt like I wanted, and how many of you have had something similar in your own experience? Right? Yeah, it can be like that. And there are other ways that the connection of inner and outer transformation is challenging that may be less obvious. And one of the ways we can understand this is to look at the very structure of the modern world. The very way that the modern world developed in the last 300 or 400 years. And here I'm making use of the work of the sociologist Max Weber. Some of you probably have studied Weber. And also the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who have very incisive understandings of the nature of modernity. And according to them, the structure of modernity was to break apart the unified worldview of the Middle Ages, in which everything in the West was organized by the Catholic Church, more or less. You know, and you had your understanding of the earth, your understanding of people, understanding of the inner life. All of that came under the dogmas of the Catholic Church. And one can interpret modernity as opening up new ways of seeing. And generally speaking, there were three dimensions which were opened up, which were also separated from each other. The first was freeing, looking at what we call the natural world from religious doctrine and looking at it through the eyes of what we now call science, looking at the world empirically. And that meant looking at it empirically, objectively. Those were some of the words used, as you know. And that involved maybe some loss, but that's what's framed the world right up to the present time. The second area that was opened up and also in a way freed from the domination by the church was what we would call the social or the political dimension. In other words, through the revolutions that took place in the US, France, and so forth, one could open up the political domain as a domain of activity that was increasingly based on public discussion of practical matters freed from religious doctrine. Right? We call this sometimes the separation of church and state. Right? And you have this second realm was opened up and separated from religion. Even though obviously that's been imperfect in various ways. But that's the core structure. And then the third area is more of the inner or subjective domain. And this was also freed from religious domination. And this became the area especially explored through art. We would say art, music, and so forth, creativity, and also through intimate human relationships. Right? That this was the domain of subjectivity. And these were all opened up in the modern world in the last few hundred years. And you could ask the question, where does religion or spirituality or contemplative practice go? It doesn't go into science. It doesn't go into public affairs. It's made something entirely subjective. You can do what you want on your own time, but that's the limit. And in terms of understanding what that means, it means that what is left of religion or spirituality has no scientific validity, no objective validity, and also has no place in the public realm. Can you see how we're getting a kind of divide here? That when you start doing inner work, how do you connect it with these outer dimensions when the whole structure of the modern world mitigates against that? Does that make sense? So I'm indebted to people like Weber and Habermas for really helping to have that analysis. And so when people like me started exploring spirituality or mystical traditions or meditation, the only place it could really be placed in this modern worldview is in subjective experience. And so it's no coincidence that, largely speaking, in the meditative traditions I've been part of, meditation has been confined to deepening subjective experience. You don't bring it out into the world because it doesn't have a place there in the modern world. You can't really do that. So this is not so widely known. Right? It's interesting. Does that make some sense? And of course, the other side of that is that the modern world, through people like the French philosophers Voltaire and others, saw religion as inherently not fit to survive into the modern world, as irrational, dogmatic. People like Freud thought that it was connected with being psychologically immature. Some of you probably have read some of those books, right? If you read a lot of these core texts, religion is seen to be something that should be placed in the historical dustbin. And then, of course, among the activists and those wanting to change the world, they're very, very commonly anti-religious. There are exceptions, of course. We find, of course, people like Dr. King, but think of Karl Marx. Religion is the opium of the people. And by that, he actually didn't mean that you shouldn't take opium. He just said it was an escape. And he thought, sometimes escape is okay. So, and this is from Max Weber. This is really characterizing modernity. The fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all by the disenchantment of the world. The ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life, either into the transcendental realm of mystical life or into direct and personal human relationships. That's where the most intense meaning is found, in the structure of the modern world. So no coincidence, again, that meditation arises and it gets placed into this subjective framework. And it's very hard to make those connections. And so this structure has had a very major influence on how mindfulness has developed. Mindfulness is often interpreted primarily something one does on one's own to find more peace and understanding. A lot of exceptions to that, but you can see those patterns. So that's my fourth point, that there are major challenges to bringing together the inner and the outer. The very structure of the modern world makes that hard. And so you can see the next step would be to say, well, let's go beyond the modern world. Right? Because the other aspect of the modern world is all these aspects are separated from each other. Our deeper values are not connected with science, not connected necessarily with public life. Everything's more fragmented, which describes a lot the way the world is. And so we could say that the world is also calling for more integration, where there's more connection. And a lot of people have been exploring that connection for a long time. The fifth point is that all of our crises and problems all of our more social, systemic problems have inner manifestations. And it's good to see that. And what that means is that we can't simply act socially or through policy, that if we don't really transform ourselves, we'll tend to replicate the problems. One way that this could be said is something I found in the 9X Yellow Pages from New York. The 9X Yellow Pages, on the cover it says, if it's out there, it's in here. Same point. If the problem is out there, it's also in here. So you could put that on your refrigerator. And so one way that this is said, and it's a very nice model, also from Joanna Macy, she talks about the Great Turning. I really recommend her books. And also beautiful website. She's a treasure, 90 years old, still going strong. We had a day at Spirit Rock on September 15th, dedicated to how contemplative practice can be connected with responding to climate issues. We had a whole day there, and you can actually go on the Spirit Rock website, and I think you can access it. It was like 6 or 8 hours. And Joanna, 90 years old, was one of the 2 people who gave presentations both in the morning and the afternoon. Really, anyway, wonderful. And she has a model of how transformation occurs. She talks about what she calls the Great Turning to a sustainable world. And she says, and this is, if a lot of my details are too many, and you want to take something valuable from the evening, you can take this. It's very brief. Okay. So she says there are three ways that transformation occurs. The first is there are holding actions to prevent further damage from occurring. And that would be the traditional province of activism. There are holding actions to prevent further damage from occurring in any area. Secondly, there needs to be an analysis and transformation of our core institutions. So looking at, in terms of sustainability, our educational institutions, agriculture, political institutions, and so forth, right? Medicine. We need to look at those and shift them so that they move towards sustainability. And then thirdly, we need to shift consciousness. This consciousness is very connected with our institutions and with the problems, right? And so part of what is helpful from her model, she says that what's important is that each of us see where we're most called, and some of us may be called to work in one of those three, but do that. Maybe you're interested in really, I don't know, developing better ecological education in the schools, right? Very significant. So maybe we do that, that's our mission, but you keep the connections with the other two realms. Right? You keep connections between those three, and then you see where you're drawn. You see where you're drawn. Again, it could be, or maybe it's to change models of parenting. Right? And to see that in this context. So the shift in consciousness is really crucial. I gave a workshop at that spiritual activism conference, and I was trying to talk about what's a curriculum for spiritual activists. I'll come back to that point in a moment. And I asked them, what are the problems that occur in your groups and organizations? And they said, well, we the anger that we don't really deal with it well. We actually take it out against each other. Right? And we have tremendous levels of infighting in our organizations. And they talked a lot about how some of the inner issues weren't really being dealt with. And that's what they were looking for. Ways to work in that way. And so we can also obviously ask questions like, how do I contribute to the climate crisis? All of us do in certain ways. I took a plane to get here. I can do carbon offsets, but I'm kind of suspicious of them, are you? I can do those, but I contributed to that. Right? How do we each contribute in both our personal behavior, in our ideas, and in our maybe lack of action? And I think the times call for a very deep interrogation of our own lives and behavior. It's not easy, right? It's kind of humbling and making ourselves vulnerable. But the change we need has to have that occur, right? We have to look really carefully and say, what's my role in this? Or what's my role in the perpetuation of racism? Again, through my institutions, maybe not speaking up, whatever group I'm in. And of course, all of us internalize things, whether we're in it's not just racism, but other forms of oppression. We all kind of internalize the same things, whether we're in the oppressed group or the non-oppressed group. And one of the pioneering areas is how to do that inner transformative work in relation to conditioning around race or gender or sexual orientation, because it gets internalized, right? I have a friend, African American, who did 3 years of work in what they, with other African American women around what they called internalized oppression. Probably many of you have studied the literature on implicit bias. Do you know that, some of that literature? What they find is that we internalize those forms of bias, even if the bias is in conflict with our professed beliefs. And that when there's a conflict between our professed beliefs and implicit bias, in terms of action, the implicit bias wins. It goes against what we say we believe. That's humbling, isn't it? And so, in a lot of places, people are trying to look and find ways to deal very closely with this. And I think Ruth King was a colleague of mine from Charlotte. She came to Charlottesville a while ago. Another person doing really pioneering work is Rhonda McGee. She came out with a book subtitled The Inner Work of Racial Justice. Has she been here?
To the triple two.
What?
She went to UVA. She has 3 degrees from UVA.
Oh, that's right. She's from UVA. That's right. Yeah, that's right. She lives in San Francisco now.
Right.
Yeah. So we have to ask, how do I contribute to this issue or that issue personally? What might I do? My colleague David Loy says, intractable social problems can usually be traced back to a diluted sense of self in ways that greed, hatred, and delusion get institutionalized. And this was said in the 8th century from the great teacher Shantideva. He said, this entire world is disturbed by insanity due to the exertions of those who are confused about themselves. 8th century. Okay. So 5th point was that we need to do the inner work because the social problems get internalized and they have their behavioral dimension. So we're all responsible in that way. The 6th point, what's the curriculum? This is what probably has the most energy for me. That's why I've developed training programs. And I could probably talk a long time on this, but I'll be brief. So, and we could design a training program, which probably could design a very nice year-long, 4-year-long program. So here's my curriculum for combining inner and outer transformation, okay? Anyone who wants to give a large grant to help this get actualized, we can talk later. Okay, so So I'll group these into a few groupings and be fairly brief on them. But this is my sense of what the training is that we need to go through to be able to connect inner and outer transformation in a mature way. And you can see that it's asking a lot. Right? And we start where we are. So first, I think we need to develop a series of inner capacities which are more traditional. Mindfulness can play a huge role. People like Ruth King and Rhonda McGee see mindfulness as central to dismantling implicit bias and racism. It's an inner component, right? It can go hand in hand with action, but one needs the mindfulness to really track what's going on and to cut through what's there. So we need to be able to notice the patterns coming through our mind. Mindfulness also helps us to be present with others, and it's really like a foundational tool. Related to that is grounding in the body and opening the heart. These are sort of traditional contemplative intentions. To ground in the body, very, very crucial, I think, for staying grounded in difficult circumstances, not being caught in stories, we could go down the list. Many of you have done contemplative practice. You know that the grounding of the body really crucial for working with times when we get activated, even when trauma might be activated. We want to open the heart, develop compassion, kindness, and so forth. We also want to develop the skills to work with difficult emotions and be able to use mindfulness and other tools to navigate when we have anger, fear, anxiety, and so forth. Incredible value of contemplative practices in that way. And then the second area I mentioned was working in an internal way to transform our internalized conditioning around all the isms, all the different 10 or 20 social hierarchies that we have internalized, and that direct our thinking again: race, gender, age, sexual orientation, educational level, religion, and so forth, and to really work through that. A third area is to really connect contemplative practices with ways to work with our own inner wounds. That we need, this is what I'm really describing is sort of a contemporary map of awakening. And this is happening in a lot of places. I think my work on transforming the judgmental mind connects contemplative practices with depth psychology. A lot of people have connected contemplative practice with trauma work. This for someone who wants to engage in the next 10 years and connect inner and outer transformation. We have to be able to work with any of our own remaining unresolved wounds and work through that and have ways of dealing with them when they get reactivated. We need also a series, this is the fourth, a series of relational capacities. One of the areas I teach in is skillful speech. And that was something which is really crucial for working together. How do we develop skillful speech that can have us be able to communicate, aiming at understanding, empathy, connection? We need that kind of training. We need to be able to be skillful with conflict. So you see, I have a broad vision. This is like a year-long program or whatever. Or 4 years, graduate school, I don't know. We need to be able to work skillfully with conflict. I'm actually going to be doing a day-long training on working with conflict on Saturday here in Charlottesville. Right? So that's a whole area. And be able to work with the various isms in our organizations, communities, and so forth. And then lastly, there are a whole set of tools related to action. I think we're slowly developing. I want to say that all of these are slowly being developed. They're at a young stage. So anyone who says, yes, I want to do that, you can join in because it's really, really needed. And so we need to be able to see the world through the eyes that, sometimes I would use a language through spiritual eyes, or through the eyes in which the values of wisdom, love, compassion are central. How do we have a different way of seeing the world? And some people are exploring that. I think of my colleague David Loy, who lives in Colorado, but I teach with sometimes, who has probably developed much more fully a Buddhist-based social analysis, in which he was the one I quoted from. He likes his first analysis is seeing the extent to which mainstream institutions are organized in terms of greed, hatred, and delusion. Not so hard to see that. We want to have that kind of social analysis. I also think of the work of Michael Lerner, who is the editor of Tikkun magazine, which is Jewish-based, but very broad in its understanding. A second area that's, I think, very crucial is further development of the traditions of nonviolence. And sometimes at Spirit Rock, I've taught short retreats and trainings with a colleague named Kazu Haga, where we bring together Buddhist practice with the nonviolence of Gandhi and King. Because the core is exactly the same. It's basically the principle, we have received pain, we will not pass it on, but we will meet pain with wisdom, love, and compassion. And that's crucial for not continuing cycles of reaction. I could say a lot more about that. And so, again, also, how do contemplative practices translate into civic engagement, community organizing, working in particular forms of work, like working in prisons or with the homeless or doing psychotherapy. A lot of people are exploring this. So really want to end by saying that these two paths really require each other. This path of inner transformation, if it's not bringing in the social transformation, it'll tend to replicate the problems out there. We can see this happening. That contemplative communities that haven't dealt well with social issues, a lot of them are particularly diversity issues, manifest the same problems. And another danger is that contemplative traditions have an emphasis on purely personal development, and so we try to develop our own personal peace while the world burns, literally these days. And that's and then there are cycles of back and forth that are important, but that can be a danger. I remember, 30 years ago, I spoke with two people about the development of contemplative traditions who had warnings. One of them was a liberation theologian named Enrique Dussel, I think originally from Argentina, who was living in Mexico City. And there was also a friend, a Thai friend, who was the founder of the network of Engaged Buddhism. I'm blanking on his name. Sulak Sivaraksha. And they both have the same message. Unless you're conscious about it, contemplative practices will be the plaything of the middle class and more wealthy people who use it for escapist purposes. Unless you actually, and that was 30 years ago. That's what they said, and I think.
Would you say that again? Say it again.
Yeah, that unless one consciously tries to make the kind of bridge I'm talking about, that the contemplative traditions, Buddhist, Sulak was talking about Buddhist traditions. Sulak was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in Thailand. And they said unless it's consciously bridged, that these traditions will tend to be escapist. And they'll tend to be escapist tools of the middle class. That was their fear. Valuable, but limited. That's where they were coming from. And there's also a way that if people who are activists and engaged don't bring in the inner qualities, there also will be issues that, I think, one can see the extent to which some models of activism are motivated by self-righteousness, demonization of the enemy, just almost like primarily by anger that I mentioned gets turned against people in their own organizations or anyone perceived as opponents. And I think that model has reached its limits, right? There needs to be a different motivation. And, actually, I think of Dr. King, he said, the heart of our movement is the constructive transformation of anger. That's what King said, probably in the 50s or 60s. And also, without what we would call contemplative abilities, activists won't have the tools to stay balanced when unexpected things happen. And so, that activists won't necessarily have the tools to work with emotions, with the difficult body states that occur in tense situations, with the thoughts, you know how our thoughts can form loops and repeat themselves? We all know that one, right? And contemplative practices can work through that. That we need, that activism without those tools, I think, reaches certain limits and contradictions. So we need a different approach. And we need, further we need, I think, communities of care. Joanna Macy said, in difficult times we need rough weather networks so that people aren't isolated. I think isolation is a big problem right now. We need to have further community, further networks. So I'll end with really just 3 quotations. Okay? The first is from Howard Thurman. People know Howard Thurman? Howard Thurman was an African-American minister, theologian, mystic, activist. Taught at Howard, taught at Boston University, came out to San Francisco and set up the first directly interracial church in San Francisco area. And towards the end of his life, around 1980, he was 80, maybe it was a little earlier, maybe 70s, he was asked by a young man, what should I do? And Howard Thurman was involved with all sorts of projects. He could have said, yeah, we really need help at the church, or why don't you consider this? And his answer to the young man was, interesting, listen to this for an activist. He said, don't ask what the world needs, but rather ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. That's a practical directive for responding in the way I've been pointing to. And then this is from a 2nd century rabbi named Rabbi Tarfon. He said, it is not upon you to finish the work, neither are you free to desist from it. And then lastly, from Dina Metzger, a very short 4-line poem called Song. This was written probably at least 20 years ago. There are those who are trying to set fire to the world. We are endangered. There is time only to work slowly. There is no time not to love. So thank you very much. So thank you very much for your patience. I talked a little longer than I thought, but hopefully brought out different points, a lot of different points, and I'm very open to any questions, reflections, discussions. And do we need to use a microphone or anything, or is that taken care of by the mics that are hanging?
Yeah, mics will pick that up.
Yeah, so you heard about surround sound. This is kind of like the inverse of that.
So does it suck up the sound?
It records you.
Oh,
Yeah, so any kind of question, comment, could be also just to share some way that you've been exploring this. It could be to share what's challenging for you in this connection, some of what we looked at in the guided reflection. Was Carolyn?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about this vision that you have, this curriculum for inner and outer work? Are there different age groups or kind of targeted audiences? A little bit more
Yeah, because I had the experience of having developed similar curriculum, but we all have cycles, which is, I think, really important. And some of my own cycle was in the last period of time, I was teaching a lot, but I wasn't doing these programs. I did 3 programs over about 15 years. The 3 different programs I mentioned, some of them at the same time, that were developing curricula for connecting inner and outer transformation. And I think it'd be good for me to, particularly the last one I did, the 2-year program at Spirit Rock. I should make a book out of that, because we gave monthly homework. The structure was we had retreats every 6 months. We had 50 people in it. we had retreats every 6 months for a week. And then in between, we had monthly small group meetings or conference calls. And we had also monthly quote-unquote homework, which involved readings, practices, mostly readings and practices people would do. And everyone in the program was engaged in some way. That was a prerequisite for the program. And so, that was a curriculum. So we had 2 years of monthly curricula, so we probably had 20 different themes that we worked on, and they're parallel to a lot of what I mentioned. How do you bring mindfulness into action? And it's also, actually, the book that I have at the back is called The Engaged Spiritual Life. That was an early compilation of the curriculum. That was something I did before the 2-year program. And that was the basis of about 10 years of work that I brought together according to 10 principles. Principles like ground ethically, develop a way to have mindfulness in action, like principles like here are ways to open to suffering and difficulty, ways to work with intention, how to balance taking care of yourself while taking care of others, working with anger, developing equanimity, working with people with opposing views, that sort of thing. Those were like the chapters were each on that. So that's a kind of curriculum. The book in itself, I don't have to do any more. The book in itself could be a curriculum, and I think there's a group in Charlottesville that's working with the book, been working with it for at least a year. And I'm pleased there are a number of groups around the country that are using the books. I have to say that sales have gone up starting in 2017. I'm really not quite sure. Yeah, but I feel called, right, it's clearly the time, if I listen to my own talk, it's clearly the time to have something a little more systematic, to come back with another training, right? Because it's partly the training, it's also the community. Being with like-minded people is a tremendous level of support, which, like I said, isolation can be a problem now, especially with all the screens. And so that's the vision, but it would also, things have further developed, like some of the work I was describing, Ruth King, Rhonda McGee, some of that work. Things have further developed. There's more. My colleague David Loy wrote a book, just had a book come out in the last few months on eco-dharma. Right? So things are moving, and it just takes time. One of the ways that I framed a lot of my work is that it took years and years and a lot of collaboration to sort of integrate the best of Western social justice traditions, in my case with Buddhist tradition, but also with other traditions. The integration takes time. It's not quick, just like the integration of meditation and Western psychology. It takes time. It takes experimentation. It takes teaching. It takes trying things out. It takes collaborating. It takes being part of networks. It doesn't happen quickly. My experience was it took a lot of time, and it took years to come to the point where I could write that book, because it took years of coming to clarity, right? And a lot of it was collaborative. I worked a lot. The book really is indebted to a friend and colleague named Diana Winston. Anyone know her work? Diana is the director of mindfulness training at UCLA, connected with the medical school. So, yeah, thank you. I hope that got at it some. So I feel called myself to find the right venue. And actually, I think I'm thinking of doing one version of this. I'll tell one more story. At the retreat center that's not so far from here, called Southern Dharma, near Asheville, North Carolina. And I've been invited to do something like an 18-month to 2-year program now. And I was conflicted because part of me, I've been teaching there a lot of what we might call depth meditation with prerequisites for people who've had a fair amount of experience. Call it depth dharma in the Buddhist lingo. Do you know that language, some of you? Yeah, anyway, to look at deeper practices involving concentration, advanced insight practice, looking into impermanence and the nature of the self and so forth. And then also opening up, bringing in the accessing of what we sometimes call non-dual awareness, which is one of the more advanced realizations in meditative traditions. I felt really drawn to do that, but I also was split because I said, what about a more socially engaged program? And it was conflicting. I said, okay, we'll do them together. Still have to work that out, but I wanted to do them together because I think it's like deepen in an inner way and then manifest it outwardly. That's what I felt called to do. So that is, I'm in the planning stages, not so far from here. Unfortunately, it's just room for 30 people. And we had more room at Sturt Rock. Other comments or questions or just sharing of your own experience, please.
I think your talk was really very interesting, especially spiritual contemplative integrate into our daily life.
Daily life.
It's really interesting. Right now it looks like it's parallel.
Just a little louder. Yeah.
Okay, so you see, your talk was very interesting.
Yeah.
Because you talk integrate spiritual or contemplative practice into our daily life.
Yeah.
Right now, what I see is just a parallel line. It goes one like this, one like this.
Yeah.
So that's the problem.
Yeah.
And then also very interesting, inner transformation and outer transformation. That's very interesting. So what I see is, without inner transformation, then outer transformation is impossible.
Yeah.
If we try to approach to inner transformation, then outer transformation will come automatically.
Yeah.
Because if we have strong inner transformation is going to be so advanced and intense, then it manifests into our physically and verbally.
Yeah.
That's easy to reach out to our family, community, and friends.
Yeah.
And then also what I see is, the person what we are facing lots of problems, any kind of problems, all are created by our mind.
Yeah.
So without inner transformation, then if we talk in conference or whatever, it doesn't help.
Yeah.
You say, it just mentioned very clearly, to solve climate problem,
Yeah.
many scientists give the suggestion, but we are not actualized, not practiced.
Yeah.
So that's the problem is due to inner transformation is not there because of political peace and that. Otherwise, if we have inner transformation ready to accept and ready to apply anything, then the whole problem will be solved. The problem is we have to, that's very interesting. I just want to say thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Your name is?
Narong Tome.
Narong
Tome.
Tome. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's for a lot of people, I think the profound inner transformation takes them into the outer world. For some people, it doesn't seem to do that though. That's in part what I've been saying. Maybe because there's some parts of their inner nature that they haven't looked at, that they're sometimes blinders. We see some things, but we don't see others. That's why I think we're really broadening the notion of what contemplative practice is, so we can say, okay, we want to look at this kind of conditioning and have that be on the agenda. But for some people, I think they do that. Some of our, I think of someone like Thomas Merton, whose place I just visited 3 days ago in the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, and he went deeply into individual contemplation, but that took him out into the world, even though he rarely left the monastery. But he would. And there's some similar stories I know from Thailand, where Achan Buddhadasa, one of the leading Thai teachers of the 20th century, who I got to meet, influenced, even though he was mostly in a monastery, he influenced a number of activists. And he had a vision that went out into the world, and they would come down and meet with him, just like people, some of you probably know, like the Berrigans and others would go down and visit Thomas Merton. Some of the great activists of the 60s Merton died in 68, but they would go and visit him. So there are ways that it went out. Please.
So you addressed earlier about how contemplation or like this.
Yeah, can you be just a little louder? We don't have a mic, and it's.
Yeah. So you addressed earlier about like how contemplation is kind of like the way kind of described by other people by like escaping reality and kind of more on like personal development.
Yeah.
But like I guess how would you kind of integrate that idea or like your idea of like inner transformation and outer transformation
Yeah.
to a society in which like it's unstable and people are more kind of preoccupied into like the physicality of the world and like kind of what's going on outside instead of like their inner transformation.
Yeah. It's thank you. The question. Everyone here? Yeah, it's a great question. It's just how do people even start, right? When many of us are, and we're all caught to some extent in this, right? But how do people even find an inner dimension when they're caught up with a lot of external things, caught up with screens and so forth, and also the challenges of just making a living and so forth. And I think educational institutions have a big role, right? I mean, I would love to see, I know, maybe I'll learn more about how the contemplative care program and the contemplative sciences program really have influenced the curriculum. And I also once was a guest, I think for about 6 days, at Brown University, which is doing something very similar. You're probably in touch with them a lot, I imagine.
Yes.
And they also have ways that the curriculum is brought into the university. One can major in contemplative studies. Can one do that here? Yeah.
We're developing a master's program.
Master's
We don't
program.
have another.
So education is one of the ways. I see that one of the upcoming speakers is going to be someone who questions bringing contemplative practice into the public schools and so forth. Because that's, I know, where I just came from. I was 4 days in Louisville, Kentucky, because having taught in Kentucky, I have a lot of friends still in Lexington and Louisville especially, and also at the monastery. I got to visit my friend, Brother Paul Quinon, who just published his memoir at the age of 77, 78, called In Praise of the Useless Life. That's relevant. But in Louisville, the mayor, I don't know how he quite did this, but he mandated that all the public schools use mindfulness. So kids learn that, and I know that's more than we have in the Bay Area, right?
So just a footnote on that,
Yeah.
It's called Compassionate Schools Project.
Yeah.
And that's run through the Contemplative Science Center here and our collaborators at the Curtis.
Oh wow, so we really
Here,
connected with
literally
Louisville.
here.
So that's an amazing program, right? That's happening in Louisville, Kentucky, right?
That's right.
And it's not happening in the Bay Area. But we have a program called Mindful Schools. I have a friend of mine started that, and I have a lot of friends who have been part of that. That has reached 15 or 20,000 kids in the Bay Area with mindfulness. So part of it is that, and again, I was surprised that it wasn't so controversial in these places because people from a more fundamentalist Christian background raise issues, right? And I think the visitor is going to raise certain issues when she comes, right, here. So I think one of the ways is to bring mindfulness in a secular form into the schools. That's being done. My colleague Diana Winston has a training program. You probably know Diana.
At UCLA.
At UCLA. And Diana has a training program for people who are professionals in various areas, law, education, medicine, and so forth, who come to her training program and they bring these practices into their disciplines, right? So that's happening. I think it has to accelerate. And, that somehow has to, so having it be more of an option at an early age where it's, and again, this is part of, I'm sure what you're doing, one can present it with the background science. And again, so it's not, to use a technical term, woo-woo. Not seen so much as woo-woo, but seen as, just common sense. These have been mainstream understandings of what's wise and grounded in observation in many cultures for thousands of years, right? And so to bring it into the schools so people get exposed to it, I know it's happening in a lot of religious institutions as well. Interestingly, I'll tell one more story, and I want to leave more time for other people. But I was asked once to be part of a retreat at Spirit Rock that was called Jewish Mindfulness. And it was going to be me teaching with 3 rabbis, along with Sylvia Borstein. Some of you may know her. She's a colleague and friend who also teaches at Spirit Rock, has done quite a few books. And I thought, oh wow, I'll offer what I can offer, and I'll learn all these Kabbalistic, Hasidic, esoteric methods from Jewish mysticism. Cool, right? And so I got there, and I found out they just teach mindfulness. They teach mindfulness pretty much like we teach it, but within using Jewish framework. And that's done in a lot of places. That's done in a number of Christian settings, and of course as well as secular settings. And so I think partly the movement to these other settings, and actually I think some of the technology is being helpful, and kind of word of mouth. A lot of people I know who are in their 20s are using meditation apps, mindfulness apps. And like my nephew is, who is what? 32. My gosh. He's 32, and he started out with probably with psychedelics, and then he graduated to apps, and now he's doing regular meditation practice. So they're different, but the apps can play a role. Please.
You just said that they're basically teaching mindfulness in this Jewish context.
Yeah.
And so my question was around how important is the context behind these different practices, and if you're going to teach it secularly, there's science behind what this stuff does to the brain, but if you just teach that, it seems like the danger is that it loses its meaning because it just becomes science. So the other way that you could go is, especially when you're offering this to children in a public school, to offer this palette of different traditions and allow them to choose. But could you talk a little bit about, what your vision would be?
Yeah, no, it's a really important question. And personally, I actually have not been so involved with the secular teaching of mindfulness. I do it at times because I've done a certain amount of consulting in medical circles, but not that much. Almost all of my teaching is more in a Buddhist context, so I don't have to worry about that. And I can also translate. It might come up, with some individuals, but generally I don't do what a lot of my colleagues do who go into more explicitly secular settings. The concern would be, and we had a discussion among the Spirit Rock teachers about what we sometimes call secular mindfulness. And the question was, because, in a sense, one is taking part of a broad tradition, taking very valuable parts, and sort of abstracting it often from the other parts of the tradition, and then secularizing it, right? And when we reflected on this, we were concerned because broadly speaking, Buddhist tradition has three main dimensions of training. One of them is, we could say, meditation. Different forms of meditation, not just mindfulness, but other forms. A second is more ethical training, training in everyday action, how you act, because most rigorous training took place in communities, in monasteries typically, and there was a very important concern about how people acted. How do you relate to others, and so forth? How do you speak, and so forth? So, first area, training, meditation. Second could be called keeping ethical integrity. And then third is more wisdom. It's the broad understanding of what one's aiming for and core principles. And we wondered, how do you bring in the second and third dimensions into a more secular approach to mindfulness? How do you bring in other words, the ethical dimension? And how do you bring in the wisdom dimension?
Is wisdom and insight, would that be the same thing?
Yeah, it's insight in the Buddhist tradition, that would be the case. We use insight sometimes in a broad and vague way. Strictly speaking, in the Buddhist tradition, there really are four core areas of insight. There's insight into impermanence. These are the four areas of liberating insight, are into impermanence, into what's called dukkha, or suffering, or reactivity. What are the roots of reactivity and suffering? So that's a big one. And then the third is insight into the nature of the self. And the fourth is, we could say, insight into nibbana or nirvana. We could, use other language, the nature of the sacred, and so forth. Those are the four areas of deep insight. How do those, now some of those you could bring into mindfulness, but the question was, how do you bring the ethical dimension and the wisdom dimension in a secular setting? And, it's not always easy. Sometimes the goals are just very modest. I went through a 2-year training in body-based psychotherapy called the Hakomi Approach. It used mindfulness. Here's how I was trained in mindfulness. I was told, mindfulness is having inner awareness of your experience. Here's your client. You have 5 minutes or 3 minutes to induce mindfulness in your client. That was it. That was the training. So, and it was a great training. But I shared some of my resources with the teachers. Yeah. Please, other comments or questions? We have just a few minutes left. Yeah.
Go ahead, please. No, you go. No. I don't know who were you pointing to here? Please.
Both are. We'll do both. I wasn't pointing to both, but yeah, it's fine.
You go ahead, because I was just sitting here.
Okay.
So I've been thinking a lot about belonging and like the potential of contemplative practices for encouraging people towards seeing more of like their interconnectedness and belonging to like a broader human sort of universal sense. And I am kind of trying to reconcile that potential with the need to at the same time like honor individual groups experiences, and I'm just wondering if you've thought about that at all in the context of your work.
By individual group experience, you mean?
Yeah, so like sort of encourage the potential of encouraging this sense that like we are all connected and all, shared humanity, but at the same time not diminishing anything around,
around
oppression
the
or
value of
struggle.
one's specific identity. Yeah, it's a great question. What comes to me first is the importance of community, and particularly having communities where people share their inner experience with each other. One of the challenges of the way the insight meditation tradition has developed in the West is that a very pervasive model is that people come together for an evening once a week. They do meditation, they hear a talk, and there's some discussion. And there's not necessarily a chance to really share deeply. Now, I think a lot, some of that sense of interconnection can come from deep looking at oneself. That's partly, I think, where you were coming from. That if you look really deeply at yourself, there can be really a sense, my gosh, look, I find everything. Like I know one of my initial insights when I was meditating and doing particularly retreats was I could find, I could find peace and calm. I could always also find extremes in my mind, like wanting to kill someone. I wouldn't act on, but don't worry. They weren't happening very often, but the point is that I would do a 2-week retreat or a week retreat, and there might be moments when I had anger, and that anger got a little extreme in my mind that I wouldn't notice unless I was meditating. The point is that I could notice that I have the potential for hatred, and even the potential for something quite awful. It's in my mind, and given certain conditions, it might manifest. And it's a way, and that kind of insight let me look. Thich Nhat Hanh has a beautiful poem called "Call Me by My True Names," in which he says, "I am the pirate who throws people off a boat," right? He has a poem like that because as one goes deeply into oneself, one sees the whole gamut of human experience. And I could notice that, I had, a few moments of hatred that got quite strong. And it's not hard to move from that to, given certain conditions, that might lead to action. Those conditions are far from occurring in my life, right? But I could see other people not necessarily all that different from me. The conditions are really different. And something happens that we would deeply condemn. Right? That opens up that sense more of interconnection. So you look deeply and you see the whole range of experience. It's humbling and sometimes shocking. So that's one way. I was going also, another way is that people sharing their close experience is a very important part of having this happen. I think of, I've done groups on the theme of transforming the judgmental mind for 18 years, because it's a theme that really I felt called to. And I do groups that are typically 8 to 12 people. And we might meet every 2 weeks or every month. And we typically begin the groups by people sharing their experience. And one of the tremendous benefits is people share intimately material that could have been previously private and connected with shame and unconsciousness. And when people bring that out and time after time see that everyone kind of has the same conditioning, it really is both very freeing from self-judgment, but it also opens people up to have that sense of, gosh, we're kind of very similar. And those are 2 examples. And I think we probably could name 5 other examples that would take us. So I think community, having time to share, and share with depth, is really, really crucial to this. And that there's some dangers of having it, of not having those aspects in contemplative practice. Maybe last one, because I see we're at time. Please.
One thing, so the way I see the world is, I see all of these people are alienated or suffering in the world.
Yeah.
And I feel like science took away the holistic experience, and religion was really constructed to control people, separate from the spiritual experience, which is a completely different, I think, impetus.
Okay.
And So I see a lot of people in the world today that I feel there is more alienation, more lack of like she was saying, belonging or whatever.
Okay.
More lack of finding these important elements out in
Okay.
the world to be reflected back. And so it seems like a huge problem to me of how do we address this in our society, because I think if we really want change, we would look at some of these issues.
Yeah.
And say, okay, well, I mean, how can you create a new paradigm? I mean, you could write good literature that creates the new paradigm, the way that you could best visualize.
Yeah.
Or you could do a good movie or a good TV show. You might reach a lot of people. I mean, I don't know. I feel like we've destroyed a lot of things that had meaning for people. And now a lot of people are not sharing in the social realm what does have meaning for them. And so I think that, I mean, do you have a solution for that?
Yes. I was pointing, all the details are not worked out, but I think all of what we're talking about is moving away from alienation, and it's moving towards connection, it's moving towards seeing interconnection. And again, I think it's one of the important things that I have found in working with people is that all one needs to do is look for one's next step. You don't have to figure it all out. I mean, I'm giving a kind of general vision of connecting inner and outer transformation. And I think that's crucial to our future. And I pointed to a number of ways one can train in that. Personally, I think it's just especially a matter of seeing where you're drawn that can contribute in that direction without trying to do too much, without thinking too much about the big picture. One's actions, one's actions can be very focused just on the group you're with. And maybe I'll end just with something that it's been very important to me, is that I think it's like if people can follow that Howard Thurman idea, see what makes you come alive, have something like this vision, and then just get engaged. Because that's what's called for. I have one student who works in a Waldorf school, doing beautiful work. She's in her 20s, maybe early 30s. And we had one time we just talked together. She wanted to connect her good work in the world, which is bringing forth a lot of what we're talking about, with action. So I asked her, how many hours a week do you want to devote? She said 5 hours. Okay, we've got 5 hours. What issue do you want to deal with? Okay, I want to deal with climate issues. Okay, so I gave her as an assignment, research your options, research organizations in the area, see if you can find one that you could devote 5 hours to every week. And she researched it, she found a great organization, she's been doing it. What happens if all of us do that? What happens if we have 3% of the population does the equivalent of that? If we have 3% of the population who do that, I believe we will succeed. Research has shown that there's research on nonviolent movements. They show that if you have the participation of 2.5% of the population or more, historically, in every situation, including with dictators, nonviolent movements have always worked. That's something hopeful to bring to mind. You don't need everyone, you need a critical mass. And the critical mass starts with each of us. Just engaging, seeing what inspires us, doing one's work, maybe doing that 5 hours. That will do it. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Anyone's interested if you're interested in buying my book, I am willing to sign it.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Carol.
I'm
Do I have time to hang out and talk to people?
Yeah, I think Michael probably went to get his car. Yeah.
No, I just want to ask where you lived in Maryland.
Oh, I was in Mexico.
Yeah, I grew up there. Where'd you go to school?
It's
been a good way. Okay, I was, the other side, I was over in the island.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah, I was right on the border.
Yeah, it's a little
Yeah, where
farther.
did you live?
I've had some walk and
I
cheese
was
in
down
Kenya.
there, in a little,
Oh, no. I don't need a second.
I was down there in those
So I will, I don't know exactly where
We're
it's. You have.
very similar.
Yes.
I was graduated in '68, which is about the same age.
We'll find our way out there.
Suzanne
Jim Young is here, nothing to do
See you.
Yeah.
But we'll see you guys. Yes, I'll see you,
Do you know where Cedarburg swimming pool is?
Yeah, my parents, my father worked well.
Oh.
Yeah, we were around there. I was on the swim team.
I was too.
Really?
Yeah.
Hey,
Sure.
no.
Suzanne
Damon.
I'll have to write down your information. Yeah, I was probably new starter. I was on the team.
With Judy Colross and Ricky Stringer.
yeah.
Who was the big tall guy, sort of tall?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was on the team.
Yeah.
Remember the Eagles?
Oh, yeah.
Roger Eagle and Ronnie Eagle.
Yes.
Yeah, we were, and
Judy Colross.
Judy Colroth, I remember. Remember Eddie Hall?
No, I don't
He
remember
was
it.
younger. We had a, we had a relay. I actually set a record for the city with Butterfly.
Really?
Yeah,
I was big on back.
yeah. I had a record that held for 2 years in
For you.
the Butterfly. And then we had a record, I think, for our relay team. We had a relay, medley relay that was.
Isn't that funny?
Gosh, and we lived in Charlottesville. Oh my gosh.
I moved down here in '90.
In '90, well, we grew up like within what,
A couple miles.
a mile or two, and we're on the swimming team at the same swimming pool.
That's
Yeah.
wild.
We just found that out.
And are you connected with the university?
No, I'm not at all.
Oh wow,
Yeah,
that's
I'm
great.
retired. And we do, Albemarle County Schools is where I retired from.
Yeah,
There are mindfulness practices being taught in the
Yeah,
schools
well.
here, so I just wanted you to know that.
well,
I'll let you get to these folks.
Okay,
Wonderful
that's cool.
talking with
yeah,
you.
I'm doing an event on Saturday.
I know, my brother-in-law died, I have to fly
Oh my
to Cape Cod, so
I'm sorry.
I'm gonna miss that. I had planned to go, but now I
Okay.
can't.
Yeah.
All right,
Hey,
safe
you
travels.
You left your. I'll give you my contact information.
Okay.
That is so cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so, yeah, send it to me.
Okay.
I got your book.
Okay.
All right, safe travels.
Thank you.
He's gonna pull his car out.
So make it out to
Make sure we could.
Michael. Michael.
You want to put your name in there too?
It's adorable.
North or?
I think Kensington, Maryland.
Yeah. We let him know about the center parking garage, like, down the
Great, good to meet you. I'm
coupon,
sorry,
apartment
my
coupons,
preference would be to now have another hour to discussion about the appeal.
Exactly. We would love that too. But we really appreciate